It was a moment that would forever be etched in his memory, a day that began like any other but would turn into a defining episode of his life and career. The conference room was immaculately arranged, the long polished table gleaming under the soft lights, the leather chairs neatly tucked in, the air conditioned to a perfect, almost clinical chill. The walls were adorned with framed achievements, accolades that spoke of the company's history, its successes, and the people who had built it. And yet, despite all the accomplishments, the environment felt tense, charged with an unspoken undercurrent of expectation, judgment, and, in his case, subtle disdain. He entered the room with confidence, his suit crisp, his demeanor calm but commanding. Every step he took resonated with the authority of someone who had earned his place at the top. Yet, even with all of that, the atmosphere immediately shifted when he walked in. The room was filled with executives who, on paper, were equals or even subordinates to him, but in practice, many of them carried preconceived notions that went beyond business. Their eyes flicked over him, assessing, measuring, questioning silently. There were subtle smirks, whispered comments that he could not quite catch, and the faintest roll of eyes that suggested disbelief in his authority. It was as if the very air of the room resisted his presence. And then it happened. In a moment so casual yet so cutting, a colleague leaned back in his chair, let out a laugh, and remarked in a tone so dismissive that it echoed through the space, "Oh, I didn't expect you to be leading this meeting." The words were not just ill-chosen, they were deliberate. There was no mistaking the condescension, the way it hung in the air like a shadow. The murmurs that followed were soft but unmistakable, a ripple of agreement, subtle yet palpable, from others who seemed eager to align themselves with the dismissal rather than the truth. He felt the sting of it immediately, a sudden constriction in his chest that was more than personal, it was professional, it was symbolic, it was a declaration that, in their eyes, he did not belong, despite every evidence to the contrary. And yet, he maintained his composure, carefully masking the flash of anger that threatened to rise. To respond in the heat of the moment could appear reactive, uncalculated, something they would have delighted in interpreting as weakness. As the meeting progressed, the public humiliation continued, woven seamlessly into what was supposed to be routine business discussion. Ideas he presented were met with skeptical glances, questions phrased in a way that challenged his credibility rather than sought clarification. Every suggestion was dissected, reframed, or dismissed with a casual arrogance that would have seemed almost humorous if it weren't so humiliating. The subtle undermining was relentless, a barrage that was as psychological as it was professional. He could feel it in the sideways glances, in the polite nods that were more patronizing than approving, in the soft, almost imperceptible chuckles when he paused to answer or explain. What made the humiliation particularly stinging was that it was public, a performance staged under the guise of a board meeting. Every attendee was a witness, every comment a spotlight shining on him, emphasizing that he was somehow less deserving, less competent, or less authoritative than the position he held. He realized that the intention was not just to challenge his ideas but to challenge him as a person, to plant doubt in the minds of others about whether he had earned his position, whether his decisions were valid, whether his presence itself was justified. In that room, he was reduced, not by lack of skill, intelligence, or experience, but by the prejudices and insecurities of those who judged him on the color of his skin rather than the caliber of his work. He sat through it with a quiet intensity, carefully measuring every word, every gesture. His responses were precise, professional, and unflinching, yet they did not fully shield him from the humiliation. Each dismissal, each microaggression, was a reminder of how deeply ingrained bias could be, how those who wielded it could weaponize social norms and hierarchies to undermine someone who posed a challenge to their assumptions. It was a trial by subtle cruelty, a gauntlet designed not with malice alone but with a cunning understanding of human behavior, social perception, and the power dynamics of a corporate environment. Throughout the meeting, he noticed the small things that compounded the humiliation. The way his ideas were attributed to someone else, the slight interruptions when he spoke, the dismissive hand gestures, the sidelong glances exchanged as if to confirm a shared joke at his expense. It was a performance of power, staged to remind him, and everyone else, that despite his title, his achievements, and his authority, he could still be marginalized. And yet, beneath the surface of humiliation, he felt a rising determination, a recognition that this moment, as painful and degrading as it was, also held a lesson. It was a lesson in perception, in patience, and in the careful orchestration of influence. He was aware that every eye in that room was watching, not only for the content of what he said but for the reaction he would give. The humiliation was public, designed to provoke, to elicit a response that could be used against him. And though his composure never faltered outwardly, internally he catalogued each slight, each calculated dismissal, each microaggression. He understood that the room was not just a place of business, it was a stage, and he had just been thrust into a scene scripted by others. The experience, as degrading as it felt in the moment, became a catalyst, igniting a resolve that would later define his legendary response. From the very first interaction, it was clear that he was being judged not for his achievements, his intellect, or the vision he brought to the company, but for the color of his skin. The subtle glances, the faint hesitations, the quiet doubts that rippled through conversations were all rooted in assumptions that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with bias. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the power of perception. In a world where status and authority often hinge on how others see you rather than what you know or accomplish, being underestimated could be just as dangerous as being attacked outright. From the outset, people treated him as if he were an outsider in a space he had earned the right to occupy, as if his presence was somehow an anomaly or a mistake that would soon be corrected. In meetings, he noticed it immediately. When he spoke, his ideas were often met with surprise, as though the fact that they were thoughtful, strategic, and innovative was somehow unexpected. Suggestions that would have been embraced with nods and approval if delivered by someone else were questioned, challenged, and dissected with an intensity that revealed more about their assumptions than his capabilities. He could see it in the way people leaned back, folded their arms, or exchanged knowing looks with colleagues, silently asking each other whether he truly belonged in the room. Every conversation carried an invisible weight, a subtle pressure to prove himself over and over again, simply because of a factor that had nothing to do with his skills or experience. Even outside of formal meetings, the underestimation was pervasive. Casual interactions, seemingly innocuous comments, and everyday decisions were colored by the same bias. When he entered a room, there was a pause, a momentary recalculation of expectations. People assumed that he was there to observe, not to lead, to listen, not to dictate, to follow, not to innovate. The assumptions were so ingrained that they often went unspoken, yet their presence was felt in every hesitation, every overlooked contribution, and every subtle dismissal. It was a pattern he recognized quickly, and while it was frustrating, he also saw it as a challenge, a problem to be solved with patience, strategy, and precision rather than confrontation alone. One of the most difficult aspects of being underestimated because of skin color was the way it undermined authority without ever overtly acknowledging the bias. Colleagues and subordinates who might have otherwise respected his position instead treated him as an experiment, a test case to see whether he could measure up to expectations they had already unconsciously lowered. Decisions he made were questioned not on merit but on perceived capability, successes were met with surprise rather than celebration, mistakes, no matter how minor, were magnified to reinforce the narrative that had been quietly set against him. It was a form of professional gaslighting, a constant reminder that he had to work harder, speak clearer, and prove himself repeatedly in ways others never did. He also noticed the impact it had on those around him. New employees, team members, and even external partners were subtly influenced by the assumptions that others held. They looked to see how he was treated, whether his words carried weight, and whether his presence commanded respect. Their perceptions could be shaped by the behavior of others before they ever had the chance to judge him on his own merit. In this way, the underestimation became a kind of ripple effect, spreading through the company and influencing interactions, decisions, and relationships. It was an obstacle not only for him personally but also for the broader impact he could have on his organization. Despite the constant underestimation, he refused to let it dictate his behavior. He understood that reacting with anger, frustration, or defensiveness would only confirm the biases they held. Instead, he channeled the experience into a quiet, relentless determination to demonstrate competence and command respect in ways that were undeniable. Every project he led, every initiative he spearheaded, and every decision he made became an opportunity to showcase his skill, intellect, and vision. He allowed his work to speak louder than the assumptions, creating results so compelling that even the most skeptical observers could no longer ignore them. There were moments, of course, when the underestimation stung deeply. Situations in which he had to repeat himself, explain concepts more thoroughly than others would require, or assert his authority in subtle ways were exhausting. He recognized the emotional labor involved in constantly navigating a world where he was seen through the lens of prejudice rather than performance. Yet, these moments also sharpened his focus, heightened his strategic thinking, and reinforced his resolve. He knew that while bias could not be eliminated overnight, it could be countered with consistency, excellence, and a careful orchestration of influence. In reflecting on these experiences, he came to see the power of perception as both a barrier and an opportunity. Being underestimated because of skin color forced him to develop skills, strategies, and insights that many leaders might never cultivate. It taught him patience, observation, and the subtle art of managing expectations while quietly subverting them. He learned to anticipate challenges before they arose, to navigate conversations with foresight, and to deliver impact in ways that were undeniable, leaving no room for doubt. The underestimation was not merely a personal affront, it was a systemic challenge that demanded a response measured in strategy and vision rather than reaction. He understood that the true power lay not in proving them wrong through confrontation, but in orchestrating outcomes that could not be denied, results that spoke with clarity, authority, and undeniable impact, leaving observers astonished at what had been accomplished under their very noses. He knew from the outset that any reaction had to be calculated, precise, and beyond impulsive emotion. Revenge was not about immediate gratification, it was about long-term impact, a demonstration of intellect and strategy that would leave no room for misinterpretation. In the aftermath of the humiliation and underestimation, he retreated inwardly to a space where thoughts could be organized, ideas could be assessed, and a plan could take shape. This was not a process driven by anger alone, it was fueled by clarity of purpose, an understanding that the most effective responses were crafted with meticulous attention to detail, patience, and an unwavering focus on outcomes. Every slight, every dismissive glance, every subtle attempt to undermine him became a data point, a piece of information to be analyzed and incorporated into a larger strategy. He began by carefully observing those around him. Every colleague, every executive, every individual who had participated in the humiliation was studied for patterns, behaviors, and weaknesses. He noted the moments when their confidence wavered, when their judgment was clouded, and when their own insecurities influenced their decisions. Understanding their tendencies was crucial. A successful plan of revenge required not just strength, but insight into how others would react, what they valued, and how they could be influenced. He realized that revenge executed without strategy could easily backfire, reinforcing his detractor's narrative or leaving him vulnerable to further manipulation. The goal was not chaos, it was transformation, a shift in perception that would permanently recalibrate how he was regarded within the organization. Next came the identification of opportunities. He reviewed past meetings, projects, and communications, looking for patterns that could be leveraged to demonstrate his competence in ways that were undeniable. He mapped out initiatives where his leadership could have measurable impact, areas where his insights could create outcomes so remarkable that no one could dispute his value. He also considered the timing of each action, understanding that strategic patience would amplify the effect. A well-timed intervention, executed when the stakes were high and attention was focused, would carry exponentially more weight than a rushed or spontaneous reaction. He visualized scenarios, anticipated counteractions, and mentally rehearsed multiple approaches to ensure that when the moment came, every move would be deliberate and precise. He also understood the power of narrative. Revenge, in its most effective form, was not only about action but about perception. He contemplated how each step he took could influence the story that others told themselves about him. Every decision, every success, and every demonstration of leadership became part of a larger narrative, that he was competent, unshakable, and deserving of the respect that had been denied to him. He considered the psychology of those who had underestimated him, anticipating the surprise, disbelief, and eventual recognition that would accompany each carefully orchestrated victory. Crafting this narrative required subtlety and finesse. It could not appear forced or vindictive, but rather inevitable and justified, as if the results themselves spoke louder than words ever could. Resource allocation became another critical component of his plan. He assessed the tools, people, and projects at his disposal, identifying how each could be leveraged to maximum effect. Mentors, allies, and even skeptical colleagues became part of a network that could support his strategic initiatives. He knew that revenge executed in isolation was fragile, but revenge executed with the right network and resources behind it could be unstoppable. Each person he engaged, each project he chose, and each communication he initiated was deliberate, aligned with the ultimate goal of demonstrating authority, intelligence, and mastery over situations that had once sought to diminish him. The mental aspect of planning was equally important. He spent countless hours analyzing not just actions but reactions, preparing for every potential scenario, every resistance, and every challenge. This required a discipline that went beyond ordinary professional rigor. It demanded emotional control, the ability to detach from the sting of humiliation and channel energy into constructive, forward-looking strategies. By maintaining this clarity, he ensured that his actions would be effective rather than reactive, powerful rather than impulsive, and transformative rather than transient. He also embraced a principle of stealth and discretion. The most effective strategies often go unnoticed until the results are undeniable. He avoided signaling intentions prematurely, knowing that revealing his plans too soon could allow detractors to adapt, block, or undermine them. Instead, he cultivated a quiet intensity, an aura of composure that masked the depth of his planning. To those around him, he appeared focused on regular business, on the surface maintaining professionalism, while beneath, a meticulous strategy was unfolding. This duality, appearing calm while orchestrating complex maneuvers, became one of his greatest advantages, allowing him to surprise those who had dismissed him. Finally, he recognized the importance of measuring success at every stage. Every action was designed to create tangible results, and every outcome was evaluated for its impact on perception, authority, and influence. He refined his approach continuously, adjusting tactics based on feedback, observation, and the shifting dynamics within the organization. The strategic planning of revenge was not static, it was dynamic, iterative, and responsive, a combination of patience, intellect, and foresight that transformed what could have been a moment of weakness into a foundation for legendary triumph. Once he had carefully observed, analyzed, and planned, he recognized that the next step was to transform his position, resources, and authority into a tool of leverage that could reshape the dynamics of the boardroom. Power, in its truest sense, was not simply a title or a position, it was the ability to influence outcomes, to command attention, and to create circumstances that others could not ignore. He understood that in order to exact meaningful revenge, he needed to operate not just from a place of authority but from a place of undeniable leverage, where his decisions and actions would carry weight far beyond their immediate context. The realization dawned that influence was not something granted, it was something cultivated, strategically deployed, and wielded with precision. He began by identifying areas where his authority intersected with the ambitions and dependencies of others. Every executive had objectives, projects, and vulnerabilities, and he meticulously mapped these intersections, understanding where his involvement could tip outcomes in ways that highlighted his indispensable role. In doing so, he transformed routine responsibilities into opportunities for leverage, converting ordinary projects into strategic moments where his influence would be most visible and impactful. Every decision he made, every initiative he led, became a demonstration of the power he held, not as a threat, but as an undeniable reality that others could neither ignore nor diminish. Communication became one of his primary tools. He spoke with clarity and confidence, carefully choosing words that reinforced authority while subtly signaling the breadth of his understanding. He learned to frame ideas in ways that aligned with the interests of others while simultaneously advancing his objectives. This dual approach ensured that colleagues saw value in supporting his initiatives, even if they had previously underestimated him. Through strategic communication, he converted perception into influence, making it increasingly difficult for detractors to question his competence or leadership. His voice, once treated with skepticism, began to carry weight, and the impact of his guidance became increasingly visible across the organization. He also leveraged alliances and networks with calculated intent. Recognizing that influence multiplies when supported by others, he engaged colleagues, mentors, and even skeptical observers in ways that subtly aligned their interests with his. By demonstrating expertise, reliability, and vision, he inspired trust, built loyalty, and created a network of advocates who would amplify his initiatives. These alliances became force multipliers, allowing him to extend his influence beyond the scope of formal authority and creating a system in which his decisions carried both direct and indirect weight. Every collaboration was a strategic investment, designed to strengthen his position while simultaneously undermining the assumptions of those who had underestimated him. Resource management was another avenue through which he converted power into leverage. Budgets, personnel, and projects were not simply operational tools, they were levers that, when applied thoughtfully, could shift outcomes and highlight his indispensability. He allocated resources in ways that ensured success while demonstrating strategic foresight, creating visible results that reinforced his competence and decision-making ability. By aligning resources with objectives in a calculated manner, he not only achieved tangible outcomes but also showcased the depth of his influence, turning ordinary management tasks into powerful demonstrations of authority. Timing played a critical role in the effective deployment of power. He understood that influence is most potent when applied at moments of heightened significance. He waited for opportunities where his actions could create maximum visibility, where the impact would be both immediate and memorable. Strategic patience allowed him to orchestrate situations in which his leverage became undeniable, forcing acknowledgement from those who had previously questioned or dismissed him. The careful calibration of timing ensured that his influence was experienced as a force of inevitability rather than confrontation, a demonstration of capability rather than a reactive measure. He also recognized that power is amplified when it is subtle yet pervasive. It was not necessary to dominate every interaction overtly, rather, he cultivated an aura of competence and foresight that permeated decisions, meetings, and projects. Colleagues began to anticipate his contributions, respect his judgment, and consider his perspective in ways that subtly shifted the organizational dynamics. By embedding influence in the fabric of daily operations, he ensured that his authority was recognized and respected, even in moments when he was not actively asserting it. This quiet but persistent application of power allowed him to create a ripple effect, reinforcing his position while maintaining professional decorum. Part of leveraging power involved demonstrating the consequences of underestimating him, but doing so in a way that was strategic rather than reactionary. He allowed his successes to speak for themselves, creating tangible evidence of capability that could not be disputed. Every completed project, every improved metric, and every initiative that exceeded expectations became a testament to his strategic influence. These achievements gradually reshaped perceptions, forcing colleagues to reassess assumptions and acknowledge the depth of his authority. In doing so, he transformed power into leverage that was not just personal but systemic, altering the way the organization perceived and responded to his presence. Ultimately, he understood that true leverage comes from aligning personal competence with the broader goals of the organization. By demonstrating that his authority, decisions, and influence advanced shared objectives, he created a framework in which his power became essential, not optional. This alignment ensured that those who once doubted him now found themselves dependent on his insight, guidance, and strategic acumen. By turning power into leverage in this manner, he not only solidified his position but also set the stage for the ultimate response to the humiliation and underestimation he had endured, making his eventual triumph both undeniable and unforgettable. The moment of payback did not arrive suddenly, it was the culmination of careful observation, meticulous planning, and strategic execution. Every action leading up to it had been designed to create maximum impact, to ensure that when the time came, the response would be undeniable, unforgettable, and inescapable. He understood that a reaction executed hastily or without preparation could be dismissed or misinterpreted, so he waited, biding his time, letting anticipation build in ways that would magnify the effect. Each small success he achieved along the way served as a quiet reminder to those who had doubted him, a subtle prelude to the moment when all the power he had cultivated would manifest in its most visible form. When the moment finally arrived, it carried with it a weight that stunned everyone in the room. He had positioned himself in such a way that the outcome could not be ignored, and when he acted, it was with an authority that left no room for negotiation or denial. The air shifted immediately, the subtle hum of anticipation turning into a palpable tension as observers realized that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. There was no shouting, no drama, no overt displays of anger. The impact was achieved through precision, timing, and undeniable evidence of competence. Those who had once pushed him aside, dismissed his ideas, or underestimated his capabilities suddenly found themselves confronting a reality they could not have predicted. The execution of his payback was both calculated and elegant. Every step, every decision, and every communication had been aligned to ensure maximum visibility and impact. Colleagues watched as projects he had championed flourished, as strategies he had implemented achieved extraordinary results, and as initiatives that others had doubted proved transformative. Each success was a subtle but unmistakable statement: the person they had underestimated was not only capable but indispensable, and their previous assumptions had been gravely misguided. The shock came not from confrontation, but from the undeniable truth of achievement, a display of power and skill that could not be ignored or explained away. One of the most powerful aspects of the moment was its timing. He had carefully chosen a point when attention was at its peak, when the stakes were highest, and when the audience, both direct and indirect, would be most aware of the implications. By aligning his actions with critical moments in the organization, he ensured that the impact of his payback would be amplified, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond the immediate boardroom or meeting. The results were visible, measurable, and impossible to dispute, leaving even the most skeptical observers to confront the reality of his competence and authority. The psychological impact on those who had doubted him was immediate and profound. Faces that had once carried smirks of superiority now reflected disbelief, surprise, and a grudging acknowledgement of the misjudgment that had occurred. The subtle underestimation, the whispered doubts, and the dismissive comments that had once punctuated his experiences now seemed almost absurd in light of the results. He had transformed what was intended to belittle him into a showcase of skill and influence so undeniable that those who had wronged him could not escape its effects. In essence, the payback was not only a professional triumph but a psychological turning point, a moment that recalibrated the dynamics of respect and authority within the organization. Equally significant was the manner in which he executed his response. There was no vengeful spectacle, no overt attempts to humiliate those who had pushed him aside. Instead, he relied on the power of results, the credibility of outcomes, and the weight of evidence. By allowing his achievements to speak for themselves, he created a form of payback that was inescapable, irrefutable, and far more impactful than any public confrontation could have been. The shock was compounded by the elegance of the execution. Those who had doubted him were forced to recognize his competence and authority on his terms, not theirs, and in doing so, they experienced the reversal of fortune in a way that was both profound and humbling. He also understood the importance of perception in the moment of payback. Every colleague, every executive, and every stakeholder observed not only what he had accomplished but also how he carried himself while doing it. The calm confidence, the measured demeanor, and the quiet satisfaction that accompanied his achievements amplified the effect, creating an aura of mastery that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and doubt that had once surrounded him. This contrast made the moment of payback even more dramatic, emphasizing the disparity between their previous assumptions and the undeniable reality of his capabilities. The impact extended beyond individuals to influence the culture of the organization itself. Witnessing the consequences of underestimating him prompted a shift in behavior, attitudes, and expectations. Colleagues who had previously doubted his abilities now approached interactions with caution, respect, and recognition of his authority. Subtle power dynamics were recalibrated, and the patterns of behavior that had allowed underestimation and dismissal to persist were disrupted. In this way, the moment of payback was not merely a personal victory, it became a transformative event with lasting implications for the entire organization. Every detail of the execution was deliberate, from the timing of announcements to the visibility of results, ensuring that the shock was both immediate and enduring. By combining patience, strategy, and influence, he created a moment that transcended ordinary success, elevating it to a spectacle of intellectual and professional mastery. The reactions of those who had doubted him, the acknowledgement of colleagues who had once questioned his authority, and the undeniable results of his initiatives converged to create a scene that would be remembered long after the initial impact, a testament to the power of strategy and the precision of his calculated payback. The journey from humiliation to triumph left him with more than just professional victories. It created a legacy that would shape his identity, influence the organization, and inspire those who witnessed the transformation. He understood that true leadership was measured not only by immediate results but by the enduring impact of one's actions, the lessons imparted to others, and the example set for those who might face similar challenges. Every step of his comeback carried significance beyond personal vindication. It was a statement about resilience, strategy, and the power of perseverance, demonstrating that even the most calculated and deliberate setbacks could become platforms for growth and inspiration. One of the most important lessons he absorbed was the necessity of patience and strategic thinking. Immediate reactions, driven by anger or emotion, would have undermined his objectives and possibly reinforced the underestimation he had endured. Instead, he learned to channel every slight, every doubt, and every dismissal into data for decision-making, a foundation for carefully orchestrated action. He recognized that setbacks were not endpoints but rather inputs for refinement, understanding, and future planning. Each challenge became an opportunity to sharpen skills, anticipate responses, and prepare a path that led to undeniable results. The legacy of patience and foresight became an enduring lesson, not only for himself but for those who would come after him. Another critical aspect of his comeback was the demonstration of resilience in the face of bias. Being underestimated and publicly humiliated because of skin color could have easily fostered bitterness or disillusionment. Instead, he used those experiences as motivation, a fuel for proving not just competence but mastery. The legacy here was profound. He showed that external judgments based on prejudice need not define one's trajectory, that true capability and determination can overcome even the most deeply ingrained assumptions. His story became a beacon, illustrating that resilience coupled with strategic action can dismantle barriers and challenge systemic biases, leaving a trail for others to follow. He also emphasized the power of influence and leverage as part of his lessons. Understanding that authority alone does not guarantee respect, he demonstrated how to convert position into meaningful impact. Through alliances, strategic use of resources, and thoughtful communication, he turned his power into leverage that reshaped dynamics within the organization. The lesson was clear: success is not only about individual brilliance but also about the ability to inspire, direct, and influence others, to turn collective efforts into results that reinforce credibility and command respect. This approach became part of his enduring legacy, illustrating that leadership is as much about subtlety and strategy as it is about visible authority. Equally important was the lesson of transforming humiliation into an opportunity for growth. He had faced moments when underestimation and public dismissal could have been crushing, yet he reframed these experiences as catalysts for introspection, skill development, and strategic mastery. He recognized that the sting of humiliation was temporary, but the knowledge gained from navigating it could be permanent. By turning adversity into a learning experience, he not only elevated his own performance but created a template for others to understand that challenges, however unfair or biased, can be harnessed to produce extraordinary outcomes. The legacy also extended to the organization itself. His journey reshaped perceptions, influenced culture, and redefined expectations. Colleagues who had once doubted him were compelled to acknowledge his competence and authority, leading to a more equitable recognition of merit. The ripple effect of his comeback fostered an environment where talent, skill, and strategic thinking were increasingly valued over prejudice or preconceptions. In this way, the lessons of his story went beyond personal vindication, they became institutional, embedding principles of respect, fairness, and strategic excellence into the organizational fabric. He also imparted lessons in emotional intelligence and composure. Throughout the process, he maintained a calm and measured demeanor, understanding that visible reactions could either amplify or diminish his influence. By mastering emotional control, he modeled a form of leadership that was both authoritative and inspiring. The ability to respond rather than react, to act with calculated intention rather than impulsive emotion, became a defining element of his comeback. This lesson resonated deeply, highlighting the importance of self-mastery as a cornerstone of leadership and long-term success. Furthermore, the story emphasized the significance of foresight and planning. Every success in his comeback was the result of deliberate choices, careful observation, and anticipation of potential challenges. He demonstrated that impactful leadership requires more than vision, it requires the strategic orchestration of people, resources, and timing to ensure that outcomes are both effective and recognized. This lesson, embedded in the narrative of his journey, offered a blueprint for others to understand how thoughtful preparation can turn obstacles into stepping stones and adversity into opportunity. The comeback also reinforced the principle that true victory is measured not only by immediate outcomes but by the enduring impression it leaves. He showed that a response grounded in strategy, competence, and composure creates an impact that reverberates far beyond the initial moment. Colleagues, peers, and subordinates internalized these lessons, gaining insight into how respect is earned, authority is maintained, and obstacles are transformed into opportunities. The legacy he created was as much about shaping minds and perspectives as it was about tangible professional achievement, leaving a mark that would inspire, instruct, and influence long after the initial events had passed. Finally, the cumulative lessons of his comeback became a testament to the power of human resilience, intellect, and determination. They illustrated how adversity can catalyze growth, how prejudice can be countered with strategy, and how influence, when wielded effectively, can redefine relationships, perceptions, and outcomes. His story offered enduring wisdom, showing that with foresight, patience, and calculated action, even the most challenging circumstances can be transformed into opportunities for extraordinary achievement.